We've been living in the most atypical, bizarre period in human history. The very concept of globalization, the idea that you can participate in some sort of supply chain or source some product or sell some product on the other side of the planet, this has never happened before without some degree of military control and escort. But at the end of World War II, the Americans scrapped the old imperial system that generated the war. And we said that we would patrol the global ocean so that anyone could play. You could sail anywhere at any time, interface with any partner, participate in any manufacturing, access any raw commodity, and sell into any market. If in exchange you would side with us against the Soviets, and that created the world that we know. And it sounds like just a simple guns for butter deal, but you got to remember how fractured everything was before 1945.
Hmm.
If you were in a country that didn't have oil, then you didn't industrialize. If you were in a country that didn't have farmland, then your population was minuscule. Globalization allowed everyone to sell what they were good at and buy what they weren't good at, and everyone in the world became a specialist. And so we now have soy on farms in Iowa that's most productive in the world. But we also have semiconductors coming out of Taiwan, a country that was pre-industrial by every definition until very recently. And every part of the world can play now. And that has encouraged this mass diversification, and it's encouraged this mass explosion in economic activity, particularly once the Cold War ended in 1992. But it was already always artificial. And it was always based on the Americans continuing to hold up the ceiling. The United States has been edging away from that ever since 1992 when the Cold War ended, and we're in the final days of that right now. And that's only kind of half of it. Is when you allow everyone to participate in global trade, people move off the farm and they take services and manufacturing jobs in town. On the farm, kids are free labor. You have a bunch. In town, kids are really, really expensive pieces of loud, annoying furniture. So you
Right.
have fewer because adults aren't stupid.
Yep.
You play that forward for 70 years, and we have had a population bust in the making, global in scope for decades now.
Mhm.
And most of the advanced world has now aged past the point of no return. That includes countries like China. So in this coming decade, it's not just that we're going to see populations aging out of being competitive. We're going to see populations aging out of being sustainable and actually being countries. One of the many, many, many outcomes of the 2020s is the end of China as a unified nation state and as an economy. But this has all been hardwired in now for 40 years, and we are finally reaching the point where the page turns.
Yeah, Western countries and China and Russia and certainly Western Europe. I mean, you can't have a country if you don't have children.
Yeah.
So that is really going to rearrange the map. I mean, I think of especially like Japan, right? What will happen in 5 to 7 decades? I mean, will other countries just invade Japan's land because there's just no one there to protect it? I mean,
Well,
how
there's no
does
one close by that has a demographic that's much better than Japan, so I'm not worried about that specific outcome for the
fair
Japanese.
enough, but that you don't need to have the country next to you in order to take it,
Fair
right?
enough. Fair enough.
Yeah.
Now, every country is going to have its own story because every country started aging at a different point and they started aging at a different rate. And how you live in urban versus rural zones is dependent upon the local geography. So, an example on the positive side, we started industrializing in the United States 200 years ago. So, for us, this hasn't been a 40, 50-year process. This has been a
Mhm.
200-year
Right.
process. And so, our birth rate has dropped incrementally that entire time, but we've adapted to it as we've shifted into the cities. So the United States still today has the highest birth rate among any of the advanced worlds. We're the most slowly aging country.
Mhm.
But if you go to a country like, say, China, that only started the industrialization process in about 1985,
Mhm.
they crammed 200 years of economic advancement into 40 years.
Yep.
That also means they crammed 200 years of demographic adjustment into 40 years.
Tell us what that means. I mean, we all know about the one child policy and so forth, but what do you mean when you say they crammed that into 40 years?
So, one of the reasons why the Chinese have been so economically successful in many people's eyes is because they have done 200 years of industrial development, building out industrial plant and infrastructure and power lines in a single generation.
Yep.
In the United States, we did that very slowly over the generations. We didn't finish even electrifying the countryside until the 1960s. And
Wow,
so
that's amazing.
for us, we were able to adapt each step of this into our cultural evolution. That's one of the reasons why in the United States, you're far more likely to live in the suburbs than the urban cores, because
Mhm.
we did this on a slow process and we can make adjustments and people can still have families of size in the suburbs. In the case of China, the population was already relatively high. And when they made the jump, they skipped all the intervening steps. They didn't have to develop cell or telephones that were on landlines. They skipped right to
Right.
cellular.
Yep.
And in doing so, they went into denser and denser footprints very, very early in the process. So you went from a subsistence farm to a high rise condo in a generation.
Right.
And when you're in a condo, no kids. So one child, is that part of it? Absolutely.
Yep.
But one child is the secondary factor
Yep.
in the Chinese demographic collapse. The single biggest one is that they all moved in small condos in a very short period of time, and everyone just stopped having kids altogether.
Yeah.
So we know now that China will cease to exist as a functional demographic structure and economy this decade, because it's not just that they ran out of children. That was 30 years ago. They're
Mhm.
now running out of 30 somethings.